Hi, this is an excerpt of a live webinar that was filmed on the 6th of June 2023. Therefore, the contents of this video are applicable from that date, and of course things may well have changed since then. This is the second part, and this part deals with non-high risk buildings in the new regulatory framework.
Thank you very much, Andy. I'm going to give you a bit of a talk about non-high risk buildings, because the Building Safety Act applies to all classes of buildings, not just high risk buildings, the buildings over 18 metres or over 7 stories. It applies to all types of buildings. The difference is that for buildings which aren't high-risk buildings, the choice of building control provider is still down to the client. You can either go to the local authority or the registered building approvers such as ourselves. The application process is broadly similar to what we have at the moment. There are some small changes to it as well. If you want to make a building regulation application for a non-high risk building, and that can be anything from a small domestic extension to a new supermarket or a new hospital, which is under 18 metres, 7 stories, or a care home, a sports ground, all kinds of buildings which can actually be quite complicated, quite large and quite big, but if they're not high risk buildings, then they fall under the non-high risk category, and therefore you can go to the local authority or a registered building approver. There are two sides to this approval. There's the schemes which require or are controlled by the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order, which are basically the non-domestic type of buildings. So if they are non-domestic, controlled by the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order, and you have to do a fire brigade consultation, then they are on the left-hand side of the slide. And on the right-hand side of this slide, the smaller domestic or house building schemes where you don't have to make that application for or consultation with the fire authority. But with both of these processes, first of all, you have to make a building regulation application, either through the local authority or a registered building approver. And those registered building approvers have to be registered, as the name implied. We have to register, you have to get a licence to practice. Local authorities don't have to, because they are controlled under the local authority obligation to provide the building control service as the provider of last resort. But both local authorities and registered building approvers have to employ registered building inspectors. And the registered building inspector is a controlled function, and it's only a registered building inspector who can undertake the site inspections, issue plans certificates or plans approval certificates, or issue the final or completion certificates as well. So the actual function of building control has to be done by a registered building inspector. So it has, and registered building approvers or the local authority have to employ registered building inspectors to do that function. So the application is made, and to the local authority or the building control approver. The building control approval local authority gets their registered building inspectors to undertake the approval process, the plans approval process, the fire brigade consultation process if required, and also the site inspection process. But as part of this as well, there are duty holders defined within the Act, and those duty holders have a responsibility to provide information to the building control approver or the registered building inspector to allow them to determine the building is compliant. So there is a requirement and a responsibility placed upon duty holders to provide that information to the registered building inspector for them to make their decisions. And then to issue the final certificate when it's all completed and everything is correct, or to the satisfaction of the registered building approver or local authority and the registered building inspector, then the RBI or the registered building inspector will issue that or sign that final certificate on behalf of the registered building approver. So as it's, I think you're probably finding from the language I'm using there, It's quite a regulated process that they've described here. Very similar to what we've got at the moment, but there are some subtle changes in that the registration process has to be complied with, have to go through that process, and you have to make sure that it's a registered building approver, local authority or a registered building inspector who's actually undertaking these functions. I mentioned earlier about duty holders, and the Building Safety Act defines duty holders within it, and these duty holders you'll probably be quite familiar with if you are aware of the CDM regulations and have had experience with CDM, and the duty holders are very similar to what is described within the CDM regulations. But they've been brought over and introduced into the Building Safety Act, and therefore these duty holders apply to all classes of building work. It doesn't matter whether you're doing a small domestic extension or a high risk building. These duty holders, the same terminology, the same language, the same requirements and obligations apply. However, the amount of information required by the duty holders for a small domestic extension is going to be significantly less than what will be required on a high-risk building, but the principle is exactly the same. So the key duty holders are the client. Ultimately, the client has the responsibility to ensure that all other duty holders within the process are competent and adequately qualified. Principal designer and principal contractor are the other two main duty holders within most schemes. So these duty holders are described, they're identified, and they've also got their responsibilities which are on the screen in front of you. So their responsibilities have been defined within the Act. So the client has got to appoint a principal designer or principal contractor. I'm aware we're talking here about non-high risk buildings. This could include a small domestic extension, and the client might not want to appoint a principal contractor or principal designer. They might be wanting to do that themselves, or they might decide that the costs involved with actually appointing a principal designer and principal contractor are in their view not worth paying. If that does happen, then all those roles and responsibilities as duty holder default back to the client. So if you are the principal designer and you're on a smaller domestic scheme and you've been identified as a principal designer by the client, you have those responsibilities, and also if you're the principal contractor, you have those responsibilities. So those duty holders will be defined at the point of application for building regulation approval, and then there could also be sub-consultants or subcontractors and also other designers which are involved in the scheme, which should also be described and identified as part of this process and the application process. So all these duty holders have to demonstrate that they have the required competence, except clients. So all other duty holders would have to demonstrate that they have the appropriate level of competence or the appropriate competence to undertake the work of the complexity that they're looking at. So the competency of the principal designer for a small domestic extension is going to be vastly different from the complexity of a principal designer for a high-risk residential building. So there can be a big scale of competencies within these disciplines, but everybody within the scheme or within the process has to demonstrate their competency. And the BSI have introduced these PSA documents, publicly available standards for assessing and defining, or they call it the specification for the competency of principal designers, principal contractors, and there are other duty holder competency documents out there as well. There's also professional bodies are doing work on this subject. For example, structural engineers, their professional body is undertaking a process where they're trying to define what the competency of structural engineers would be for the different ranges of schemes they use. SIBC as well is doing something similar. So trade organisations a professional organisation, shall I say, are also undertaking these reviews to try and come up with a framework for people to assess competency within their particular disciplines. So when you make a building regulation application for a non-high risk building, that application is made to either local authority or registered building approver such as ourselves. And within the application form, you would have to provide a certain level of information. A lot of this information is already required, and without it we can't really do the approval, because it needs a description of the work, it needs the address, it also needs the client's contact details. But what is slightly different here, where it's built up with another layer of information, they now require duty holders to be identified. So the principal contractor and the principal designer, if known, should be provided on the application form. If those people aren't known, or it doesn't look like they're actually going to be defined within the construction process, then those responsibilities would then default back to the client. So what I can see is on the smaller domestic schemes, if you get a planning application and the architect is engaged to get planning drawings, then they'll then say, we can take this forward, get your building regulation package, and we will become the principal designer for this scheme. There's be a fee involved in that. Sometimes a client will decide to pay that fee, sometimes they wouldn't. So I can see situations here where it can cause a little bit of confusion at the start, but the way we see it, if the client puts down the principal designer as the architect, we would notify the architect that they've been nominated as the principal designer, and if the architect feels they aren't the principal designer, then they should contact us and correct us. And the same with the principal contractor as well. So that hopefully will overcome this small problem which we can potentially foresee with the client putting people's names down whilst those people don't actually believe they are the principal designer, principal contractor. There should also be a statement on whether the building is required to be assessed under the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order, and also what sort of legislation is being used to determine compliance with the building regulations. It'd be a description of the existing building. If they are doing works to an existing building, we'd require a description of what the building is at the moment, and then also a description of the building work and how it's going to change that building as well. So there's this before and after description within the application form for works to existing buildings. And then also with the existing building, there's a little bit more information that we'd require in terms of the details of the intended use, the height of the building, provision for drainage and such like. And if you're building over a sewer, you'd have to define that, but then that is actually within the existing requirements of the building regulations. And also if there are any local acts. So in terms of the actual plans, the absolute minimum which is defined within the Act is an OS map or a site location plan at a scale to 1 to 1250, showing where the building work is being undertaken and how that relates to adjacent buildings and boundaries. So that's the absolute minimum. The likelihood is, though, that once that, if you do just provide that absolute minimum of information, that allows us to accept the application, but then we can ask for more information as we feel fit or is required. So the application can be made with a minimum amount of information, but then more information can be requested. And the likelihood is we would do that. So the duty holders themselves, they're identified within the Act. They're also identified within the construction design management regulations as well. But the Building Safety Act does say that the building control body should expect the duty holders to proactively demonstrate that the project will comply with the building regulations. And that's slightly different to perhaps what's happened in the past, where we've looked at the scheme, we've tried to assess it and made our decision as to whether it meets the requirements of the building regulations or not. There's more of an obligation on the principal designer, principal contractor and client, whoever it is, to proactively demonstrate that they've undertaken a review themselves and they feel that it meets the requirements of the building regulations, and this is why. So it's putting together not just a drawing showing a compliant building, but there should also be some information contained either on the drawings or in a separate report that explains why or how the building has been assessed, what the process that's been followed to assess that building, and why it's felt that it meets the requirements of the building regulations. And that's all parts of the building regulations, from structure all the way through to what is now charging points for electric vehicles. So it's A to S in the building regulations. You're supposed to look at every section and explain and demonstrate to building control, practically demonstrate that the building scheme which is being proposed meets the requirements of the building regulations. So there are transitional provisions within the Building Safety Act, and for non-high-risk buildings they're not really going to be applicable too much. If you've got an application in under an approved inspector or local authority at the moment, we're going to transfer from approved inspectors over to building control approvers. There is going to be if we got a current application in place, that's automatically going to transfer over under the Building Safety Act. There might be some amendment notices that need to go out to just change the name of ourselves or the approved inspector, but that again, we're trying to avoid that if we possibly can. But for non-high-risk buildings, the process should be relatively straightforward. You make an application to your local authority or to the registered building inspector or registered building approver, should I say, and that is from when the new act comes in, it will be through the registered building approver. Up until then, it will be through your approved inspector. For high-risk residential buildings, it is slightly different, and I'm going to let Andy talk about that later on, but you have to get your application in and you also have to start on site to then continue with your chosen building control body, otherwise it defaults back to the Building Safety Regulator. And with that, I'm now going to hand over to Andy, who's going to talk to you about how the Building Safety Act applies to higher risk buildings as well.
Thanks, Joe.